Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the complete works of Plato, translated by Jowett. We're going to take a look at the first half of the original document of the Phaedo. We've covered the introduction. Now we look at the first half of the original document. It's going to be pages 155 to 182. And it will cover the first and the second proof for the immortality of the soul. We will cover the first and second proof. And then the second half of the manuscript will cover that third and fourth proof, all covered in the introduction. Let's go to block 1. Death is a pilgrimage and a separation. Pilgrimage. Death has the character of a pilgrimage, a summoning from God, who is the guardian of our soul. In death, we go to other gods, wise and good, to obtain the greatest good, as the soul separates from the body. Separation. The philosopher is concerned with the soul over the body, and true existence is revealed in thought. The mind gathers into itself, taking leave of the body. The light of mind acquires the absolute forms, not the bodily senses. The light of mind acquires the absolute forms, not the bodily senses. They bring confusion. So, Socrates, as written by Plato, tells us that death is a pilgrimage in the next life to that which is greater, because it's the acquisition of pure wisdom, the possibility of the acquisition of pure wisdom. It's a greater good. It's a pilgrimage toward a greater good. Now let's go to block 2, and we look at the first proof that is given by Socrates through Plato for the immortality of the soul. The first proof is the dialectical return of elements into their opposites. Being made ready. At death, we hope that our mind has been made ready and purified. The final purification is the separation of the soul from the body, to be released from the chains of the body. And this is the study of the philosopher, because the philosopher does practice dying to the flesh in order to attain wisdom in its purity. So the philosopher practices dying to the flesh. That is what the philosopher does in order to attain that wisdom in its purity. Therefore, the philosopher faces death with courage, because death is the exchange, the ultimate exchange for wisdom. The first proof for immortality. Opposites are generated out of their opposites. Life is generated out of death. The soul is born again out of the dead. The souls of the dead exist in some place out of which they come again. The axiomatic proof is this. It is a dialectical return of elements into their opposites. Nature is, life is, equal to a dialectical return of elements into their opposites. Therefore, death results in the return of the elements into their opposite, meaning life. The soul is reborn again, and again. So it takes us on to block 3. The second proof for the immortality of the soul is the theory of recollection. Remember the introduction. Recollection. The soul has acquired knowledge from a previous time, a knowledge of the essences of the dialectic acquired prior to birth. We came into life having knowledge. Learning, therefore, is the recollection of these ideas, a recollection of these essences, a movement from perception through the senses to the notion of the idea. So it's a movement from perception to notion. The self is in a process of recollection, a process of comparing the sensations. Souls and ideas both pre-exist as real and as absolute existence. Souls and ideas pre-exist as real, genuine existence. Absolute, real, genuine existence. And learning is to recollect this realm of ideas that the soul is already acquainted with. Now, comparing sensations, ideas are simple. This is key. Ideas are simple, self-existent, unchanging forms. They are not compounds. They are not compounds. They are not harmonies. That's going to be important to understand when later Plato tells us that the soul is not a compound, not a harmony, not a combination. Ideas are simple, self-existent, unchanging forms, not admitting any variation. The sensations are changing appearances. The sensations participate in the forms. Therefore, the seen changes, the unseen remains unchanged. And the soul and the ideas are linked together as the invisible, the unseen. And they remain unchanged. They are not compounds. They are simple, self-existent, unchanging forms. Simple, self-existent, unchanging forms. But because we have this knowledge of the eternal forms, Plato tells us that obviously the soul has been reborn and reborn again, and again. And therefore it has this latent presence, this latent knowledge, this spark of the divine, this image of God, latently present in the self. And because that is the case, there is a latent presence of these simple, self-existent, unchanging forms. And through our experience in reality of comparing our sensations and then drawing analogies from those sensations, so it's comparison and analogy, we recollect, we call up again, and activate that latent knowledge of the simple, self-existent, unchanging forms, the realm of the ideas, with which, because the image of God is in us, is already latently present. It needs to be sparked and recalled, and that is called learning, says Plato. Learning is recollection. And the theory of recollection is a proof that the soul is immortal. So in the first half of the Phaedo, we learn that death is a pilgrimage toward perfect wisdom, because the philosopher spends his life denying the flesh in order to exalt and affirm the soul, the higher part of humanity, in order to attain purity of wisdom, the divine wisdom. And the first proof of that is in Block 2, the fact that life, when we evaluate life, we see and recognize a dialectical return of elements into their opposites. Life is a metaphysical dialectic, and we participate in a historical dialectic in finitude. There is a metaphysical dialectic of life, of the divine going out of itself into creation and then returning to the self dialectically. There's a metaphysical dialectic and there's a historical dialectic that we confront in finitude. and it is the dialectical return of elements into their opposites. Death is generated out of life. Life is generated out of death. And then a second proof of the immortality of the soul is the theory of recollection, which says that the soul includes this internal spark within the self, this image of God, this image of the divine, that includes a latent knowledge of the eternal, simple, self-existent, unchanging forms. The soul has an affinity and a relationship to these simple, self-existent, unchanging forms. And learning is to call up this divine spark within us. It's a theory of recollection, and it is a second proof for Plato of the immortality of the soul. It is a second proof of the immortality of the soul. So, quick recap. In the first half of the Phaedo, we learned that Plato affirms that death is a pilgrimage to pure wisdom. Block 1. Death is a pilgrimage beyond death to the next life as a pilgrimage toward purity of wisdom. Block 2, the first proof of the immortality of the soul is the fact that we are confronted by a dialectical return of elements into their opposites when we examine life. Life is a dialectic, a big circle, a circular dialectic of the return of elements again, and again into their opposites as an ever being reborn. Life is a circular dialectic of ever being reborn. And then block 3, the second proof for the immortality of the soul is the theory of recollection. We have a latent presence within us of a knowledge of the simple, self-existent, unchanging forms. That's going to wrap up the first half of the original document of the Phaedo, pages 155 to 182. And the next lesson is going to be the second half of the Phaedo, 182 to 214, and that will conclude the Phaedo. So next lesson, we will cover the second half of the original document. The second half of the original document, 182 to 214. That's going to wrap up 155 to 182.